Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. For decades now, scholars of American foreign policy have urged that we apply international methods to study international relations. Ernest May, for example, counseled us to go to foreign archives and study the past from non-American perspectives, and that impulse has only gained in momentum. Others, like Petra Gadi or Akira Ari, have encouraged us to consider American foreign policy in a global or transnational context. There are many advantages to this prism. It provides a holistic view of the way that ideas, people, goods, and culture move across borders, and it shows the connections and dislocations among communities. It facilitates a diversity of voices and engenders empathy. With that in mind, if we turn our attention to Europe in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, what do we see? Several competing empires are in the process of colonizing Africa and Asia, building economic networks, expanding their military might, promoting their culture, and increasing their influence. Germany is the new empire on the block. France and Britain are racing to gather as many overseas territories as possible, while Portugal and Spain are generally on the decline. Almost every European nation is seeking colonies, whether small atolls in the South Pacific, African riverbeds, Caribbean islands, or ports along China's coast. Now, why does this matter for the United States? We know that the U.S. by the end of the 19th century will acquire an overseas empire to add to its already expansive continental empire. But before that, how did European imperialism affect the American mindset? How did the U.S. react to the so-called scramble for Africa and China? How did the U.S. view anti-colonial revolutions in places like Egypt? These are the questions that Professor Andrew Priest confronts in his latest book, Designs on Empire: America's Rise to Power in the Age of European Imperialism. Andrew is a senior lecturer of history at the University of Essex in the UK, and before writing Designs on Empire, he's written on American foreign relations in the 20th century. His first monograph, Kennedy, Johnson, and NATO, is pretty much the standard text for understanding the transatlantic security alliance in the 1960s. And he's also published a wonderful edited collection with Andrew Johnston on presidential elections and foreign policy, which is a comprehensive look at elections from the 1940s to the 1990s and how they directly impacted on international relations. You can think of neutrality policies in the 1930s all the way to Clinton's Wag the Dog war in Kosovo. I'm delighted that he's decided to turn back the clock and explore the 19th century. So welcome to the show, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Mike. I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, I'm pleased you're here as well, not least because I know you better as a 20th century historian. Your first book was on transatlantic relations in NATO. It's really become a very standard text for that time period and the Kennedy-Johnson years. I'm just so curious, what made you decide to go back to the 19th century?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's actually part of the answer, at least, is to do with the teaching that I was doing at the time. I started teaching more on the early years of US foreign policy. And I became more and more interested in what you might call the origins of US power, and especially the relationship between politics, diplomacy, and ideas and ideology in the development of that power. And as I got more and more into it, there seemed to be more to say about that kind of thing than had already been said. And I sort of started asking around and talking to a few people and trying to bounce a few ideas. And one of the things that came up was about the relationship between the US as it became more imperial, if you like, and the other empires. And so I was also aware, being influenced by some of the books that I'd read when I was an undergraduate, especially things like Walter LaFeber's The New Empire, that this was a really kind of rich area, and I just sort of a rich area and an important time period, and I felt that perhaps it needed kind of revisiting in a way, and so this is the late 19th century, before the US became an empire itself in most people's minds. And so these things all sort of started to come together, and I suppose I just wanted to kind of set myself a bit of a new challenge. So there was also a kind of practical element to it as well, in that, there are a lot of people working on the Cold War, on post-1945 US history, and especially US foreign policy. And I just thought it would be interesting to move into a new area. So as I said, these things sort of came together, and I started to do a bit more reading and then a bit of research, and I got to the point where I thought, I think I could do this, and I think I could say something interesting and new about this period, about the US at this time, and especially about the US relationship with empire.
Naturally, I agree with you entirely about the Cold War and contemporary history dominating the field. What your book does is that it explores American foreign policy from the years after the Civil War to 1898, which is, as you say, that year that we all think America becomes an empire. And what happens in that period is a massive expansion of colonial territory that we don't always associate with American empire. Do you want to tell us why these years are so formative, and maybe even summarize how the United States viewed European empires?
Sure. So I'm glad you think that. I'm glad you kind of responded in that way, and I think you're right about the fact that sometimes the period of new imperialism, or whatever you want to call it, in European history is often kind of dislocated or separated from things that are going on in the US. And I did really want to. That was one of the reasons I started to look in a bit more detail at this particular period, because I thought, that there is something important to say here about bringing these two sort of strands together. Yeah. So so I think this particular period is so important because of the fact that the US was expanding so rapidly at the time economically. Of course, it was massive immigration, which was changing its relationship with the rest of the world in all kinds of different ways, and other scholars have looked at that. And so I think this is, in many ways, these were the kind of formative years in terms of US expansionism, foreign policy. I don't think, that I didn't want to think of them as sort of exclusively formative, because I think they're important in and of themselves. There's always a danger, I think, in looking at 1898 and kind of projecting back and saying, so I didn't sort of, that's important to a degree, but I didn't want to do it sort of exclusively. But I think it's very important to consider the period from the Civil War. The Civil War obviously is a crucial period in foreign policy, but the fact that the US was changing so rapidly, and these changes had to have an important influence on the way it was thinking about the world and responding to changes that were taking place there. I mean, in terms of the way that the book came about, I originally thought about trying to do it as a kind of narrative history of changing ideas about empire, and sort of doing it as a kind of broad treatment, almost like a kind of long essay or something like that. But as I got more into it, I thought that was going to make it difficult to read, kind of quite diffuse and sort of not particularly helpful to people. And so in the end, what I decided to do is the series of what I've been calling kind of case studies, where looking in depth at a number of different episodes. And I could see that there were potentially disadvantages to doing that way, but it seemed to me that there were enough advantages to do it like that. So in the end, I ended up looking in some detail at responses to the French Empire, especially over the intervention in the 1860s in Mexico, where France moved to put a European prince on the Mexican throne. Then the Spanish Empire in relation to Cuba, and especially the 10 Years' War from the late 1860s through to the late 1870s. And then looking at British intervention in Egypt in the early 1880s, and therefore the British Empire. And then looking at European empires more broadly, but especially the German Empire in the 1880s, and particularly with reference to the conference in Berlin that carved up West Africa during that period.
I mean, I think the case studies make perfect sense. The reasons why they're there, you make a good case for them. And I'm going to ask you a little bit about individual cases that really struck me as important and formative. But I also wanted to ask you about how European empire comes to influence American ideas, as well as the actions in those case studies. How does European imperialism come to give the United States the sense of its own foreign policy?
Yeah, so I think firstly, I would say that the United States was born out of an empire, and so it's important, as the starting point, if you like, for understanding the US, and I think especially for understanding US ideas, because I think, there's an almost kind of instant reaction among most Americans that the United States fought against an empire and therefore it is anti-imperial. And I realize that may be massively oversimplifying, but I start the book with a quotation from Barack Obama, supposedly at least liberal politician who made a couple of important statements in relation to this, but one of which I start the book is that the United States isn't like other empires because it's not self-interested. That's what he says, and the US isn't looking for resources or territory. This struck me as a very interesting kind of jumping off point, because it's the way that it kind of illustrates the way that Americans still in recent times think about the United States as being different from European empires, and I think that's a really crucial aspect of this. That there is there's an almost kind of knee-jerk reaction, I suppose, to ideas about European imperialism, where they're taken as being negative, of course, and the United States is taken as being different. And even though there may be recognition that the US does some kind of similar things to those empires, in that it's played an increasingly important global role, that it's gone out and at times done things that look a lot like imperialism. For the most part, it hasn't done those kinds of things. If it's expanded into contiguous territory. When it hasn't done that, that's tended to be the exception rather than the rule. And this helps to tell a particular kind of story. So I think this is the way that the European empires are juxtaposed a lot of the time with stuff that's going on in the US. And I wanted to really complicate that story and talk about the ways that Americans kind of accepted aspects of European imperialism under certain circumstances, and that could also help explain how these ideas could influence the ways that Americans thought about how the United States should act on the global stage.
In fact, we could probably get into a long debate or conversation about what American empire looks like, how we use it as a lens to understand policy. There's been so much written about that over the last 20, 25 years. So your book outlines a number of ways that the US believed it was different from Europe. Can you tell us about those and what that might say about American exceptionalism?
Yeah, sure. So, I think the US thought of itself as being different in a number of different ways. Firstly, I suppose the way that it had to respond to empires was important here, and I talk about this in the book. In that the US, even after independence, continued to struggle with empires. Empires were a direct material threat to the United States, and so it tended to regard these, of course, very, very negatively. So you're talking about the continued influence of the Spanish Empire, the French Empire in North America to a lesser extent, and obviously the British Empire in the Caribbean and to the north in Canada and what became Canada. So all of these things influenced American thinking, because it affected everyday politics in the United States in the early years, especially as it was a very precarious republic in the early decades. I think increasingly this was tempered and influenced by the Monroe Doctrine, after 1823, in the ways that the United States started to use the doctrine increasingly, and its salience grew over the course of the 19th century, and especially in relation, of course, to the Americas, to what increasingly became seen as the United States backyard, as it were. So I think this also influenced the way that Americans thought of themselves as being different, because they now had this kind of this document, this doctrine that they could refer to, and talk about the influence of the European powers on the United States. And I think all of these things kind of led to the idea that that the United States was different, that the United States was opposed in large part to these European empires, and this had a very long-term impact. And in the first chapter of the book, I actually talk about lots of these kind of antecedents, if you like, to the main points that I was trying to make about the 1860s and beyond, that a lot of these early ideas about anti-imperialism, about the way that the United States was thinking of itself in opposition to the European empires, were being formulated long before the Civil War.
I was going to pick up on that. So there's been a good deal written about the Monroe Doctrine and the intentions of it lately, probably more so than there has been, back when Walter LaFeber was writing The New Republic, or The New Empire, I should say. And it seems to talk a little bit more about intent, the intent of the doctrine, the intent of the United States, what the foreign policy's intentions are. Herfried Munkler, who you cite in your book, has this definition of imperialism that talks about a will to empire, that a state necessarily desires an empire. Do you think the U.S. has that will to empire in the 1860s, or at some stage do you see in the Gilded Age progressive era that it develops this will to empire?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the short answer to that is yes. I think it's definitely developing that will to empire, but I suppose it also depends on the type of empire that you're talking about, because there's, it's relatively easy to see how, if you regard empire as being an aggressive form of expansionism, and imposition of your will on and rule on other territories and peoples, then without doubt the United States was doing that from its earliest days. I mean, you have to look at the expansion across the United States, the imposition of slavery on new territories. All of these different kinds of things are definitely a will to empire. Of course, where Americans would draw a distinction in large part is about non-contiguous territories. That through most of this period, I think most Americans would say the United States doesn't do the same kind of thing where it builds a navy to go overseas and conquer territories. Now, of course, that is starting to change, and there's evidence of this in various different contexts, even before the United States goes to war with Spain, invades Cuba and the Philippines. But I would still say, but of course, this is in essence all of these things that have gone before, or one of the reasons that it sets off this debate in the United States in 1898, because it's really contrasting with it's rubbing up against this idea again about what the Americans do. One of the other points, though, in terms of the will to empire is the sense that the United States is building at this time, and certainly the many of the elites that I focus on mostly in the book, the sense that they're getting that they can do at least some of the things that the European powers are doing, and that's one of the reasons why I sort of build the book to the last substantive chapter is about the Congo Conference in Berlin in 1884 and 1885, because this is an actual moment where the United States is having to grapple with this problem of anti-colonial imperialism, or whatever you want to call it, where they're actually dealing with the European powers. And even though in the end they reject the treaty because a new administration, a supposedly anti-imperial administration, comes in, I think it's still a very important moment, because through all of this, the attitudes to empire, the thinking about empire, it doesn't just move in a straight line. It goes backwards and forwards. There are different strands of thought running simultaneously. It's an incredibly complex process. But I think more and more you can see a sense that the policymakers in the United States regard themselves as being increasingly important players in the world, and that part of that means operating in certain ways, and because it is an imperial world, that means that they're a part of it. So I think that's really where a lot of this kind of imperial mentality comes from.
W. Brands once described it, I forget the book, but he once described U.S. foreign policy as vacillating between leadership by example, and maybe that harkens back to that anti-colonial, post-colonial view of themselves, America, and then on the other hand, actively remaking the world in its own image. And do you think there's some distinctions to be drawn between the imperialism of continental expansion and the imperialism of overseas or non-contiguous expansion?
Yeah, there are some distinctions to be drawn, I think, but I think I'd be careful about drawing too clear a distinction between it, because I think there are very obvious similarities and traits that you can see in both, because it is to do with power and thinking about power and thinking about the ways that power is used. And a lot of the stuff I discuss in the book, I think it's very important to think about race and hierarchies of race, and the way that different territories are conceptualized in different ways, and the people, and obviously the peoples within them I'm talking about here. So I think I'd be cautious about drawing too clear a distinction between those two things. But I think where you're absolutely right on this is that thinking about the difference between, and this is where looking at the Monroe Doctrine is so illustrative, thinking about the differences between leading by example and then the more kind of remaking the world or remaking aspects of it, because I think there is I think where it starts to shift, especially in the period that I'm looking at, is it does move from more of a kind of US as example to a more kind of interventionist and more kind of active role that is taking place. It's still limited at this stage, and I can't make any claims that it's clearly 1898 there's no doubt that it's a key moment in the development of American imperial thinking as well as its actions. But I think there's a lot more going on beneath the surface, and I think this tension between leading by example and sort of remaking the world, I think is really it's much more of a struggle during this period.
A lot to unpack there too. It's a bit unfair of a question, really, in some ways, because the differences between settler colonialism and maybe a more sort of formal colonialism or territorial expansion without the same sort of settler status that maybe Australia would have had, or New Zealand. There's different types of empire that we're talking about here. I think it's great that your book doesn't dodge the issue of race. It's front and center throughout it. That's really important. And I think we could, look at the way the U.S. foreign policy looks at race, whether it's in Cuba, in Mexico, in Egypt, or in Africa. But I was actually most interested in, when I was reading the book, about what American foreign policymakers thought about Europeans and racially the hierarchies that there are in Europe at this time. So how is that? What do policymakers think about, say, the difference between Spain and Britain, France, and Germany?
So yeah, that's a good question. I think you're right. There's been a lot of focus on racial or perceived racial differences in conquered territories or colonial spaces or whatever. And I think there is probably a lot more to be said on how the US regards the imperialists. I mean, one of the points I wanted to make in the book is that this kind of different sense, this different perception of these imperialists, so France, Spain, Germany, Britain. It is very important, but I think it's also firstly important to note that I think on the whole, Americans regard themselves as being more closely affiliated with those imperialists than they do with the Cubans, the Mexicans, the Egyptians that they're looking at. So I think this kind of affinity is really, really important. But there are differences within that, and they do have, what I increasingly started to think of as kind of like hierarchies of empire or hierarchies of imperialism, because they definitely, on the whole, there's no doubt that the British Empire, however cynical people are about it, and there are a lot of people who are of course opposed to it in the United States, who think that Britain is a terrible imperial leader in the world, and as its power is peaking around this time. There's no doubt that there is more sympathy for some of the things that Britain is doing than the most of the other powers that are being discussed here. So there's a kind of, I always call it a sort of grudging admiration for the fact that Britain has been more successful than these other powers, certainly in comparison to an imperial power like Spain, which is obviously fading very rapidly at this time. And there's a sort of tension there between, on the one hand, going back to what I was saying about the United States as anti-imperial because it's broken away from the British Empire. There's also a growing recognition, based in part on the burgeoning diplomatic relationship between Britain and the United States, that Britain is a better colonizer than most of these other powers. I think France is an interesting one, because I think probably a bit that I should have done a bit more on in the book, looking back on it, is spoken about, as I look at a particular moment in French history when Napoleon III was emperor. He'd taken power and declared himself emperor, and so there's a lot of cynicism about France in that particular moment. But I guess it's also significant in afterwards, when there's a republic again. France continues to be an imperial power, and indeed grows its imperial power. But certainly in the 1860s, the US is very cynical about French power, and especially in comparison to Britain. France is seen to be kind of politically not as mature as either Britain or the United States, and that has an impact on the way that it conducts itself in terms of its foreign policy and its imperial policy. So you get this kind of, as I said, it's the sort of hierarchy of empire, as Americans would see it, mostly with Britain at the top and probably with Spain at the bottom. And of course, with Spain, sorry, to go back to Spain, and to a lesser extent with France, a lot of this is because they're Catholic countries, and they're not seen to be, as politically mature, as I said, but also kind of not as culturally mature, I suppose you'd say as well. That they've got various different kind of deficiencies, and the way that Americans see this sort of manifesting itself, playing itself out, is that they tend to be much more, as they see it, I should stress, as they see it. These lesser forms of empire tend to have to impose themselves much more harshly. They tend to be much more violent. They tend to be much more aggressive and repressive of the populations that they're ruling. They tend to be much less efficient, as they would see it. Whereas, those who look at Britain and regard it more favorably would say, well, Britain is if I can put it this way, is much more like the empire that Americans would like to be. It's based a lot on controlling financial flows, on controlling the global economy. Britain rules more efficiently. If you look at India, it uses local officials much more. It's less violent. But one interesting thing about that, of course, is when Britain transgresses those kinds of views, as in the case that I look at with Egypt, where there's an incredibly violent, there's a war basically that goes on. that's a problem, and they either have to say, well, this is an aberration, or they have to say, well, this is the problem with empire, that it's based on violence, and that's what all of these imperial powers are ultimately doing.
I mean, I think it makes sense too, based on the people that you're looking at in the book. So, I mean, they are all kind of waspy, right? They're white Anglo-Saxon Protestant mainly, because that is the foreign policy making elite in America. And I just wondered if you could maybe say a little bit more about who these people are and how they come to influence policy in Washington.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right, and this is undoubtedly a limitation of the book. And I looking back on it, once you've finished, you're always thinking about things that you could have done a bit differently. And I think probably the thing that I should have made more of are other voices that were there. I do try to include some of them, but most of the people that I focus on, as you say, they're WASPs. They tend to be elites. They're very much part of what you might call a foreign policy kind of club, or at least a political club. So, this is another fascinating kind of strand that's running through this, is that the policy making apparatus and especially the foreign policy making apparatus is growing during this period. And again, it grows a lot more in the early 20th century, but during the period that the book focuses on, it moves from, just the State Department is growing. There is a development in the way that policy is being made. But yeah, most of these people tend to be elites. They're born into wealthy families. They tend to have a probably fairly conservative view of the world. They're not especially concerned with radically changing the nature of the foreign policy apparatus, and so that definitely influences the way that they think about things. I mean, having said that, there are some more kind of, I suppose, radical voices in the book. There's certainly like some of the radical Republicans at the time of Reconstruction, for example, have a lot to say on foreign policy. Some of them, I guess, ironically, want the US to take a more interventionist role in the world, especially in the Caribbean. I mean, if you take the example of Cuba that I talk about in the book, some of the radical Republicans want the US to intervene in Cuba because, of course, there's still slavery there under Spanish rule, and so that would help to get rid of that and close down the problem that the southern slaveholders might just move their operations into the Caribbean. So these kinds of things are there as well. But for the most part, the people who I write about are relatively conservative. They're sort of and of course a lot of them have connections with the European colonizers, so that influences the way they think about things as well.
I don't think it's a fault of the book at all. Actually, I think it's revealing about what American foreign policy making was like in the 19th century. I mean, we're talking about a State Department with less than 100 staff. We're talking about a city that doesn't, there's no Foggy Bottom in 1860. So it's a different place, a different time. You were sort of alluding to what Washington was like at this time, and I wondered about that foreign element, about Europeans in Washington. Did you come across anything where plenipotentiaries or ministers, or there wasn't ambassadors at the time, not until 1893, I think. What influence did foreigners have in DC at that time?
Yeah, so I think they did definitely have some influence, and it is it is fascinating to try to recreate the world that existed there, like you said, when Washington was still a small place, and it was considered to be a diplomatic backwater for still in most of the period that I'm writing about. It wasn't considered to be a kind of plum appointment at all. So so there is it is kind of interesting to read about how one minister calls on another one, and they have a discussion about a particular issue. So yeah, I think there is certainly lobbying that goes on. There is a lot of there's a lot of back and forth about particular issues. I think one of the most significant areas, though, is the fact that certainly in the two cases, I mean, the two cases I'm talking about in the first part of the book about concerning Mexico and Cuba. Of course, what's more significant, perhaps, is the fact that there's a lot of lobbying by Mexicans and Cubans in Washington as well, and I think that's hugely significant in the way that Washington thinks about it. It brings a lot more pressure for intervention in both cases as a result of that. But again, I think it's significant that, I mean, intervention that's a difficult phrase to pin down, and there are all kinds of different ways that Washington does intervene. But what a lot of advocates of intervention are calling for is actually like a military intervention in Mexico, or especially in Cuba, because lots of people want to get rid of Spain. They want Cuba to have its independence and so on. So that's really the way that I see the influence of kind of foreign actors, as it were, in Washington. But I think it is significant. What I was going to say there is that I think it is significant that in the end they don't do that, and so you can probably see the influence of British, French ministers and others in the kind of Washington community, limiting the extent of how far Washington was willing to go. But you're right. I mean, I think thinking about this world and how it operated, I think is a very valuable kind of exercise, because it is so different from the way that we conceptualize American diplomacy and the foreign policy bureaucracy of Washington in the 20th century.
This is great, by the way, Andrew. I wanted to move on to some of the later parts of the book and some of the case studies, because one that really interested me was the chapter that deals with the Egyptian Urabi revolution. And I just thought maybe you might be able to tell us how that uprising helps to shape American foreign policy.
Yeah, so I'm really glad you liked it, because it was definitely the most interesting and fun to write. It was the one I enjoyed the most, partially because I didn't know a huge amount about Egyptian history and politics before I started doing it. And I chose it in part because I couldn't find that much on it, and it seemed to me something that was at least worth exploring a bit further, especially because there's been so much attention to Britain in India. And so I thought I'd, at least look at something slightly different, and something that I hadn't seen a huge amount on in relation to the US. I think, having said this, I think in some ways it's the one that of all the four cases in the book, it's the one that received the least attention from policymakers, and even from the sort of, whatever you want to call it, the engaged public. And I think that's because it was, first of all, it's far away from the US, and so it has no immediate impacts on what the US is trying to do regionally. And I think it's just one of those cases where, most Americans didn't know at the time, didn't know a huge amount about Egypt. If they did, it was probably a sense that it was, within the Ottoman Empire, but that empire was struggling, and so I think it's hard to make a case, in answer to your question, that it had a huge impact there. But what I think it revealed was some of the kind of some more of the kind of contradictions in the way that Americans thought about empires and the territories that they were engaged in. And I mean, on the point about political and diplomatic engagement, the Secretary of State at the time, Frederick Frelinghuysen, he took virtually no notice of it. I found very little correspondence in the archive where he was actually saying anything about it, and partly that was his kind of diplomatic style, but also I got the sense that it didn't mean a huge amount to policymakers. But I think it did reveal lots of these kinds of contradictions, and what I really enjoyed doing is exploring how these kind of played out in terms of some of the arguments and discussions they had about, you know, what the role of an empire was in the modern world. And I think, you know, if I could characterize it, probably simplify it, I think what the ways that it influenced Americans was in thinking about the issue of what do you do if you have a territory that, you know, is unstable and therefore kind of threatens your interests, in this case Britain and France as well, and how would you kind of deal with that problem where, you know, it looks like society's breaking down, there's effectively a civil war taking place, and you know, and so it was fascinating to see the ways that, almost kind of oppositional ways that played out, and that you had some people arguing that, you know, Britain was a huge bully, that there was something very unsavory about seeing the greatest naval power in the world bombarding a small, poor peasant country, and this was completely abhorrent. And there's a great illustration from Puck in the book, a cartoon, which shows, you know, the British Lion, you know, at the time of the Egyptian invasion, beating up these other smaller nations, which, you know, I felt kind of perfectly illustrated this. On the other hand, you've got this view that, you know, sometimes these sorts of things have to be done, and Britain was only doing what any other empire would have done, and by implication, there's a sort of sense that, you know, the US might have to get involved in this kind of thing as well. And, you know, it's played out in all kinds of different ways, most obviously in terms of, you know, race and views of the Egyptians as backward as the fact that they haven't become as advanced as they should have done, perhaps. And, you know, and then you get these, you know, really horrible kind of the playing out of these racist stereotypes and so on. There's, I mean, most memorably, I suppose that George McClellan, the Civil War general, who talks about Egyptians in this very, you know, as being like children who need to be educated in the way of the world, you know, that kind of horrible stuff. And so I think it just plays into all of these kinds of debates and ideas, even if it doesn't have a very direct influence on policy making. I suppose the main obvious way that it does is if you take the British invasion of Egypt starts off the so-called scramble for Africa in the 1880s and 1890s, then it influences the way that the US thinks about Africa, and ultimately probably that it gets involved in the Berlin Conference a few years later. But I don't think there's any obvious impact. It's mostly, as I said, in the policy debates and the sort of the exchange of ideas about what this means for the imperial powers.
I thought it was an interesting case study, not least because there seemed to be other revolts at the same time, especially for the British, whether it was the First Boer War or the Anglo-Zulu War, that it seemed to fit into the time period. And it reverberates too, I think. I mean, Egypt is going to be a flashpoint in 1909 and 1910, and it's going to make the United States certainly think about the British Empire and whether it really wants to emulate the Brits as much as they initially might have thought. You also look at the later stage of the book, the Berlin Conference. You've mentioned it as well. And you mentioned in the book that it's the beginning of the open door idea. And I love that. I couldn't agree more because I've written about that as well. But I wondered if you could just explain what you meant by that.
Right. So, yeah, of course. Well, I'm really pleased that you think that, because I did wonder whether I was trying to stretch that a little bit too far. But one of the things that the key thing, I suppose, for the US, because they do send they send delegates to the Berlin conference. They're not just there as observers; they are participants in that conference, and that's a very important thing to bear in mind, because I think it's kind of been forgotten a little bit, or it certainly hasn't been. I don't think it's got the attention that it deserves, and I think part of that is because the Cleveland administration, when it comes in, repudiates the treaty, and so it sort of gets forgotten. But I think at that particular moment, it is very important. And the way that the US justifies its participation in the conference is that they're not interested in territory. They're not interested in they're not really interested in the civilizing mission, which is obviously an important undercurrent of the discussions that take place there. What they are interested in is ensuring that the European powers can't close off these territories from the rest of the world. And of course, what they're concerned about is from the United States. So they actually send, the State Department sends a sort of trade representative almost to sail up the Congo at that time, to look for the economic opportunities which might be available to the United States. What he finds is that he declares that there aren't any, because these people, again, like going back to their ideas about race, these people are so backward that they don't really recognize the value of economic progress. So, but what they're desperate to ensure is that these areas are not closed off for American exploitation, essentially. So I just saw this as being a kind of proto open door, really, articulating these kinds of ideas, because that's the basis, really, on which the conference meets. That there are going to be untold opportunities in Africa. And the Americans are very concerned to be a part of that. So that's really what it is, in essence.
Well, I think it's spot on. I mean, for anyone that's listening that's not familiar with the open door idea, or the thesis, is that largely that the United States in China in 1899 was seeking open access to trade ports, and that it wasn't looking to colonize, and it didn't want to see European powers further colonize China and split it up into sort of spheres of influence that were autarkic, that didn't trade with other spaces. And I think that was the general gist of Berlin. More importantly, it was a European idea. I actually think the open door notes in 1899 are also a European idea. I think they're a British idea that the American policymakers like John Hay and W.W. Rockhill latch onto and make American. So it's a really interesting parallel between an earlier 19th century episode and what will become sort of one of the hallmarks of American empire in the very late 19th and early 20th century. So thanks for that.
No, it's a really interesting point, by the way, about it being a European idea. I think that's right. It's an interesting parallel with the Monroe Doctrine as well, which was obviously a British idea that the Americans took and made their own. But yeah. Sorry, I didn't explain enough about the open door, but you've done it very nicely. So
I think what I'd like to do now is just ask you a contemporary question. You can tell me if this is going too far, but I can't help but think about the parallels between the U.S. and China today, and the rise maybe of the U.S. to world power status in the 19th century. You think there's a relevance for the contemporary in your work? And I mean not to say that the U.S. emulated Europe in certain ways, and it seems to me that empires sometimes learn from past successes and failures or missteps too. So, are there any conclusions to be drawn for the contemporary context that we're in now?
well, I hope there are. I hope there's some contemporary relevance to it. And I started it with a quotation from Barack Obama, and in the hope that people would see some of the parallels. I thought about starting with the Iraq War. Of course, the Secretary of Defense at that time, Donald Rumsfeld, had a lot to say about how the US wasn't an empire, but I just thought he was a more obvious choice, and so people might, be more surprised with talking about Obama. But I think there are lots of at least contemporary echoes and ways that you can see it in parallel. I think absolutely that empires learn from other empires. They draw on ideas, even not explicitly sometimes, and perhaps even sort of subconsciously in the way that they think about their own place in the world. I mean, I'm not an expert on China, so I'd be wary about drawing direct parallels. But I think certainly, if we say that the US empire is under some strain at the moment, I hope that would be a relatively uncontroversial statement to make. But there's no doubt that policymakers in China are carefully looking at the way that the US acts at the moment, but also the way that it's acted in the past, and I think learning from contemporaries and past examples of empires is a very important thing for powers that are on the rise to do. How it manifests itself in concrete ways, I probably can't say as much about. But one of the fascinating things about I think the way that the US empire plays out in the 20th century is that, for all this talk that I show in the book about being wary of overseas adventurism, of military action, of subjugating people far from the US mainland, as they see other empires doing, it's amazing how much the US ends up doing that in the 20th century. And I'm sure Chinese policymakers have looked at the examples, whatever examples you want to take, from the Philippines through to Vietnam, through to Afghanistan and Iraq, and sort of taken some of those lessons on board. But it will be interesting to see, as if say China can't. If moves towards democracy in areas where China has a huge amount of influence arise, whether it might react in similar ways. I mean, there's already quite a lot of evidence of that in Hong Kong, I suppose, and who knows how it will play out, especially because Chinese influence is just vast now, isn't it? In Africa and in various other areas of the world as well. So I think hopefully there is some contemporary relevance. But I think if I was saying anything, it is I was interested in the way that these views and ideas played out for the US, especially in the 20th century, because I think there are all kinds of parallels and lessons for the US, especially as its absolute and relative power seems to be fading, at least a bit in the contemporary context.
Thanks so much, Andrew. This is it's really a great book, and I'm delighted that you've come around to your senses and realized that the 19th century is so much more interesting that it deserved a whole book. No, but in all seriousness, the book gives us a real insight on how the United States thought about European empires and how those ideas manifest themselves in US foreign policy. And so for that, I'm very grateful that you wrote it.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on. And if it's any consolation, I'm definitely staying in the 19th century for the next project.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.